Hello, so let's start looking at some examples of expanding brackets. So let's suppose we look at this one here, so part 2. So we have a 5x term and we need to make sure it visits everything inside the brackets. So we have the 5x visits the x and the 5x visits the negative 4. Let me just make that a bit bigger. So we have 5x times x, which makes 5x squared. And we have a 5x times a negative 4, which makes negative 20x. 5 times 4 makes 20. Okay. Now let's have a look at the next one. Well, this is just very similar to the one we were looking at the end of the last video. So we just make to make sure that everything in the first bracket visits everything in the second bracket. So here we go. We have x times x, which makes x squared. But we also have the x visiting the 5, which makes positive 5x. And then finally, we just need to make sure the 4 visits everything in the second bracket. So we have a plus 4x, and we have a plus 4 times a plus 5, which makes a plus 20. The only last thing to do would be to collect together like terms. So we've got an x squared term. How many x terms have we got? Well, we got 5x and 4x, which makes 9x. And then we just have a plus 20 hanging around at the end. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So we have an x minus 5x plus 7. Same kind of thing, we just need to be careful of the minus. So we have an x visiting the x, which makes the x squared, and the x also has to visit the 7, which makes the positive 7x. Then we need to make sure that the negative 5 visits everything in the second bracket, which makes minus 5x, and then the minus 5 times the 7, which makes negative 35, and then we just make sure that we need to simplify everything. So we have an x squared term. How many x terms we have? Well, 7x, but we're taking 5x terms away, so we have plus 2x, then hanging around at the end we still have the minus 35. This thing then is a little bit more tricky because we've now got 3 things to multiply. The way which I would do this is I'd multiply the first bracket out first of all and just pretend like that second bracket just isn't there. So in other words, just multiply it out as if it was x times x minus 1. Well, that's easy, just the x has to visit everything in that bracket. So we have x times x, which makes x squared. Then we also have the x visiting the negative 1, which makes minus x. The only issue is though, we can't just leave it like that. We also need to consider that all of that is being multiplied by x minus 2. All of that is being multiplied by x minus 2. This is just the same. We just make sure that everything in the first bracket visits everything in the second bracket. So the x squared has to visit everything in the first bracket, so the x squared visits the x, which makes x cubed. And the x squared also has to visit the minus 2, which makes the minus 2x squared. But we also need to make sure the negative x visits everything in the second bracket. So we have negative x times x, which makes negative x squared. But then we also have negative x times negative 2. Negative times negative makes positive, so we have positive 2x. And then we just collect together like terms. Well, there's only one x cubed term. And there's 2 terms with an x squared in, so we have minus 2 of them, and then we take away another one of them. So we end up with minus 3x squared. And then we have plus 2x hanging around at the end. So let's have a look at this thing then. Well, the way which I would deal with this is very similar to the last question. We just basically look at 2 brackets at a time. So let's look at the x plus 7 and the x minus 3 and pretend that last bracket isn't there. So if we do that, we end up with, well, x visits the x, so the x has to visit everything in the first bracket, x squared. Then we have the x visiting the negative 3, which makes minus 3x. And then we have the plus 7 visiting the x, which makes positive 7x. And then we have positive 7 visiting negative 3, which makes negative 21. Okay, now at this stage, I would just simplify this. So you end up with x squared minus 3x plus 7x makes positive 4x. And then we have a take away 21. Okay, so that's that first 2 brackets expanded out. The only issue is we've got to consider what happens when we multiply all of that by x plus 5. But that's easy. You just remember everything in the first bracket has to visit everything in the second bracket. So let's try this. We have x squared visiting the x, which makes x cubed. Then we also have x squared visiting the 5, which makes positive 5x squared. Okay? But then we need to make sure that the 4x visits everything in the second bracket, which means that 4x times x makes positive 4x squared. And then we have positive 4x times positive 5, which makes positive 20x. And then finally, we need to make sure the negative 21 visits everything in the second bracket. So we have negative 21 times x, which makes negative 21x, and then negative 21 times 5 makes negative 105. and then we just collect together all these like terms. So we've only got one term with an x cubed in. How many x squared terms have we got? We've got one there and one there, so therefore we end up with 9x squared in total, plus 5x squared plus another 4x squared makes 9x squared in total. And then we consider, right, okay, let's have a look at the x terms. So we have positive 20x there, then we take 21x's away, so we're left with negative x. And then finally we're just hanging around with a minus 105 at the end. There is our final answer.